The Vatican press hall, ancient and echoing with centuries of guarded truths, was unusually full that morning. Rows of journalists sat in forced silence, their eyes fixed on a single white chair at the center of the raised marble platform. The mood was not ceremonial, it was surgical. Something was about to be cut open. Pope Leo XIV, a man known for his sacred restraint and devastating precision, had agreed to a rare press appearance. Not for show. Not for politics. And certainly not for defense. His presence alone carried the weight of finality, like a bell that rings once and echoes for generations. A journalist, young, sharp, and already feared for his ruthless investigations, stood to speak. There was no reverence in his posture, no deference in his tone. He had not come for communion. He had come for combustion. "Your Holiness," he began, his voice calm but loaded, "you were present inside the basilica on the night in question. You saw it with your own eyes. And yet, you remained silent. Why?" The question, though direct, struck like a blade. The kind of blade that only cuts when it's carefully aimed. Stillness. No reaction. Not even a blink. Pope Leo sat motionless, carved from something older than stone. His face betrayed no emotion, until he turned, slowly and with purpose, to his right. Seated beside him, closer than any other living man, was Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle. A friend. A confessor. A witness. Then, without a word to the press, without acknowledgement of the question hanging in the air like incense over blood, Pope Leo leaned toward Tagle. He whispered. The room could not hear it. The cameras could not capture it. But whatever was said in that sacred breath did not remain invisible. Cardinal Tagle recoiled, not violently, but as if his soul had been quietly unseated. His brow furrowed, his lips parted, and for a moment, he did not look like a man of faith. He looked like a man who had just been shown something no one should ever see. He clutched his cross. And then his eyes, those once calm, deeply pastoral eyes, rose to meet the gathered audience. There was nothing left of calm in them now. Whatever Pope Leo had seen, whatever he had whispered, had undone something permanent. And though no one else had heard the words, everyone in that room felt their consequence. A silence spread, not the silence of reverence, but the silence of reckoning. Something had happened. And the only two men who knew what it was, weren't speaking. Not to the press. Not to the cameras. And not to the church. What Pope Leo XIV revealed to Cardinal Tagle on that day would shake the conscience of Catholicism, and fracture the illusion of untouchable authority. It was not a scandal. It was not a vision. It was something worse. The kind of truth that makes even the holy afraid to speak. Pope Leo XIV had never needed many words. He was a man shaped not by headlines but by hunger, first as a barefoot seminarian in the Manila slums, then as a missionary priest in the war-split villages of South Sudan, where sermons were whispered under gunfire and sacraments were passed through barbed wire. His papacy had not been sought, it had fallen on him like a burden from heaven, chosen not for charisma but for clarity. His silence, often mistaken for indifference, had in truth always been a discipline. An act of reverence, not retreat. To the world, he was enigmatic. To the poor, he was a shepherd. But to one man, Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, he was simply Leo, a friend, a soul tether, a man who still prayed with his shoes off. Tagle had walked beside him through every private sorrow and public storm. When bishops grumbled behind velvet curtains and world leaders demanded statements, it was Tagle who sat across from Leo in the quiet corners of Vatican gardens, asking no questions but somehow always receiving answers. He didn't need words to understand Leo. He only needed presence. But that morning, in the eyes of Cardinal Tagle, there was no presence. There was rupture. And seated just a few feet away from them, basking in the hum of international broadcast and the sanctified thrill of confrontation, was Julian Rojas, the journalist. Brilliant. Relentless. And terrifyingly prepared. Julian had earned his name digging through what others called sacred. He had exposed megachurch embezzlement in Brazil, leaked private clergy chats from London, and once caught a bishop lying under oath using nothing but a hotel receipt and a discarded cigar band. He did not fear the church. He pitied it. To him, faith was the last refuge of cowardly power. He had arrived in Rome under the guise of a press assignment, but it was a hunt. And Pope Leo XIV, in Julian's eyes, was prey draped in white. The Vatican press hall itself had become its own character. Ornate gold trim edged the chamber like a crown with thorns. Behind the Pope, an oil painting of the crucifixion loomed, as though watching with interest but withholding judgment. Every camera was live. Every reporter was ready. And every heart, Catholic or not, was bracing for revelation. In recent months, murmurs had been rising like incense before a storm. Why had Pope Leo remained silent after the revelation of the manuscript of Corinthos? Why had he offered no statement after the Vatican's unusual midnight summons of 3 Eastern patriarchs? Why had he, alone among world leaders, not responded to the massacre in Mbandaka, where Catholic missionaries had died singing psalms? Critics accused him of detachment. Of cowardice. Of spiritual elitism. But those who knew Leo, knew better. Silence was not retreat. It was often the shield of those who had seen too much to speak casually. Still, the world did not want stillness. It wanted spectacle. And Julian Rojas was prepared to deliver it. He had studied every page of the Pope's past. Every diplomatic omission. Every known companion. He knew what night the Pope had been seen entering the southern wing of the Basilica. Unescorted. He knew which guards had rotated early the next morning. And he knew that something had been taken out, something never catalogued, never archived, and never discussed. Julian's mission was not just to corner a pope. It was to crack open the illusion that faith could coexist with silence in the face of blood and fire. And now, with a question as sharp as a blade already thrown across the altar, the world waited. It waited for the answer to a question no pope had ever publicly acknowledged. It waited for a whisper to become a reckoning. It waited for truth, or scandal, to finally, irreversibly, come to light. And in that waiting, a choice lingered before every soul watching: would they merely spectate, or truly seek? If you're still watching and haven't subscribed, you're not observing. You're avoiding. You now understand the stakes. This is no place for passive eyes. Subscribe. Unless you came only for gossip. In that case, at least be honest. Say so in the comments. Julian Rojas stood slowly, reverently even, as if he knew that arrogance would crack the moment. His voice, when it came, was measured, restrained, cloaked in a tone of artificial gentleness that journalists adopt when they know their question is an ambush in silk. Your Holiness, he said, hands clasped as though in prayer, in times like these, can silence still be moral? The words floated through the hall like incense, beautiful in form but burning underneath. For a long moment, the Pope did not reply. His eyes, deep, dark, and ancient, remained fixed ahead. Not on Julian. Not on the cameras. But on something far beyond them. A memory, perhaps. Or a wound still bleeding behind his composed expression. Then, almost too quietly for the mics, his voice emerged. Even Christ, he said, stood silent before Pilate. The line landed like a stone in still water. No one moved. Even the journalists didn't dare type. Julian tilted his head, pretending to consider the response. But his next question was already loaded, locked, and aimed. Doesn't silence, he said, empower the wicked? There it was. The pivot. The unspoken accusation, delivered with a smile. The Pope's hands didn't move. He didn't blink. Only his mouth responded. Silence, he said, protects the grieving. He let the words breathe. Some wounds are too sacred to expose beneath the flash of cameras. Some pain deserves not protest, but presence. Julian's jaw tightened. He had not expected that tone, not defensive, not evasive, but elegiac. Still, he pressed on. But Holy Father, he said, with all respect, does grief justify silence when the world demands leadership? Tagle shifted in his seat. Subtle. Almost imperceptible. But those watching closely would notice. The slow straightening of the spine, the hands folded tighter over his lap, the flicker of concern in his eyes. He knew what was coming. He had seen this dance before, how truth and perception could twist around each other like incense in air. The hall, once restless with anticipation, had become frozen with focus. And still, Pope Leo did not raise his voice. Leadership, he said, is not always loud. The loudest shepherd often startles the sheep. Julian looked away for the first time, as though the room had just gotten smaller. Sometimes, the Pope added, you lead best by weeping beside the wounded, not by explaining their wounds to the world. It was not a rebuttal. It was a benediction. But it was also a warning. Not to Julian. To the Church. To the world. Tagle's gaze remained steady on the Pope. He said nothing. His role, in that moment, was not to defend, but to discern. Every syllable Leo spoke was not only an answer to the journalist, but a signal to those who knew how to listen. A message coded in calm. But even calm can thunder. And in the silence that followed, Julian realized something unsettling. The Pope was not trying to win the exchange. He was trying to witness it. To allow it. To let the weight of the moment fall not on his shoulders, but on the audience's hearts. The studio lights were warm, but the air had grown cold. Like a cathedral after confession. Like a room that had just heard something it wasn't ready to believe. If you're still here and not subscribed, you're feeding on wisdom but refusing to sit at the table. You want the bread of revelation but won't kneel for it. Either subscribe now, or say why you won't in the comments below. Let your hesitation speak. Julian's posture shifted, just slightly, but enough for the cameras to notice. The courteous mask, once delicately placed, had begun to slip. His voice, still controlled, now carried the edge of something darker. Not curiosity. Not even challenge. It was resentment, veiled in rhetoric. The Church hides behind prayer, he said, his words deliberate and slow, while the world burns. There was no gasp in the room, only the sudden stillness that comes when a taboo is shattered. Every syllable echoed off marble like a strike against an altar. Pope Leo did not respond immediately. He did not need to. He simply breathed. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried not defense, but memory. I once held a child in Gaza, he began, who had no face left to weep with. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for pity. The mother placed the remains in my hands, he said. She did not scream. She did not blame. She asked me to pray. That was all she wanted. Not justice. Not vengeance. Just a prayer spoken aloud, so that God might hear it before the next missile fell. The weight of the image settled like ash across the room. Do you think, he continued, eyes on Julian now, that I stood there calculating press releases? Do you imagine there was time for declarations and statements and alliances? He did not accuse. He did not shout. But his words struck deeper than any outburst could have. The gospel, he said, does not take sides. It takes wounds. Julian's jaw flexed, his fingers tightening around the folder in his lap. He didn't look at his notes. He didn't need to. His next line had already been rehearsed. So, he said, is that your justification? Is neutrality now a virtue? Is cowardice being dressed up as wisdom? A murmur rippled through the back rows, but Pope Leo remained unmoved. His hands now folded at his lap, he gave the smallest nod, as if receiving the insult like a gift. "No," he said. "Cowardice speaks before listening. Cowardice acts before kneeling. Cowardice hides behind loud conviction when it's too afraid to sit in silence with the suffering." He leaned forward, but only slightly. His voice dropped lower. "Neutrality is not our position. Mercy is." Julian's mouth opened, but no words came. Because what Pope Leo had offered was not a rebuttal. It was a reckoning. A reckoning of motives. A reckoning of truth. Tagle, still silent beside him, watched the exchange with the quiet intensity of a man praying through a storm. His lips moved faintly. Not in commentary. In intercession. The cameras rolled. The press held their breath. But the moment had ceased to be about policy or power. Something sacred had cracked open. This was not a debate. This was a collision of convictions. And only one of them was rooted in stillness deep enough to survive the impact. This isn't just commentary, it's confrontation with conscience. Subscribe if your heart's moved. If not, don't stay quiet. Drop your reason below. Let the world see what you stand on. Or what you refuse to kneel for. Julian's voice wavered now, not from fear, but from something far more dangerous, frustration. His tone had been respectful. Then firm. Then sharp. But now, the edges were cracking. Not because the Pope had insulted him, but because he hadn't. The stillness. The restraint. The refusal to be drawn into a spectacle. It infuriated him. And so, he dropped the veil entirely. "Do you protect truth?" Julian demanded, his voice echoing across the chamber, "or just the image of the church?" A gasp rippled across the front row. Even the cameraman shifted uneasily. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, flung like a stone against stained glass. For a long moment, Pope Leo XIV didn't move. Then, with a grace that felt ancient, he stood. No sound accompanied it. Just the soft rustle of white fabric as he rose to his full height, eyes no longer distant, but locked directly on the man who had just dared to reduce the cross to a logo. He took a breath, but not to speak. Not yet. Instead, he let silence speak first. Let the weight of what had just been asked fill the room like water rising around a drowning man. Then, with a voice steadier than iron, he began. "In the camps outside Aleppo," he said, "they carve cribs from cardboard. They cradle newborns in the hollow of plastic buckets. They baptize them with river mud and trembling hands." He took a step forward, no longer a statue on a throne, but a shepherd among wolves. "In South Sudan," he continued, "a woman handed me her child. The boy had no feet. Just two bandaged stumps. He was smiling. She wasn't. She looked at me and said, 'He still believes in angels. Please, don't let him stop.'" He paused, not for effect, but because the memory itself demanded reverence. "In Bangladesh," he said, "a boy held his sister's body for 3 days because he was told no priest would come. He kept saying, 'She'll hear the prayer if it's in Latin.' He stopped then. Not because he had run out of stories, but because the truth had become unbearable. Then he turned, not to the press, but to Cardinal Tagle. He leaned in. He whispered. Only Tagle heard it. And whatever was said in that breathless moment broke something inside him. The change was immediate. His eyes widened. Not with panic, but with revelation. As though something he believed had just collapsed. As though something older, darker, and more permanent had just been unveiled behind the veil of ceremony and doctrine. Tagle's hands fell from his lap. Open. Exposed. He looked at Leo. Then at the room. Then at nothing at all. The cameras caught everything, except the words. Then, Pope Leo turned back to the crowd. The breath he took now was heavier. Not because he was tired, but because what he was about to say would not be unsaid. "You call it naive," he said softly, "to protect the innocent." His voice rose, not in volume, but in clarity. Each word carved from something eternal. "I call it sacred." And with those 7 words, the room froze. No one typed. No one blinked. The Vatican press hall, often noisy with interpretation and commentary, had become a cathedral. And in that stillness, the question no longer belonged to Julian. It belonged to everyone. The politicians. The priests. The viewers watching from their living rooms and phones. The ones who had reduced protection to politics. The ones who had demanded outrage but dismissed mercy. The ones who had mistaken silence for apathy, because they had never understood what it cost to carry the weight of innocent blood in your own hands. If you've made it this far and still refuse to subscribe, then say it. Say why in the comments. You've heard the truth. You've seen the heart. If you're not moved, don't hide. Confess it below. Or stand with the ones who still believe in sacred things, and hit that button now. The stillness did not lift. It deepened. The words Pope Leo had just spoken hovered in the air like smoke over an extinguished flame. No one reached for a pen. No one reached for a mic. Even Julian, who had come to command the room, now looked smaller. Not embarrassed. Not defeated. But uncertain, for the first time since the cameras began rolling. It was the kind of silence that doesn't wait for permission to linger. Pope Leo remained standing. His presence had shifted. No longer the target, no longer the icon. He had become something else entirely, a mirror held up to the room. And to the world. Then, in a voice quieter than before, but more piercing than anything yet spoken, he continued. "You confuse silence with cowardice," he said. "But silence can be an act of war against vanity. A refusal to turn tragedy into theater." He stepped forward. Not toward Julian. Toward the center. "You confuse politics with principle," he added. "But we do not wear robes to speak for Rome. We wear them to kneel for the forgotten." He looked directly at Julian now. Not with scorn. With clarity. The way a father looks at a son who still thinks noise is strength. "Your questions are sharp," he said. "But your assumptions are louder." He let the pause hang, not as punctuation, but as invitation. "You want to know why we don't make statements on every headline? Why we don't rush to declare sides? You say silence empowers evil. But I ask you," he leaned forward, and the room tilted into his breath. "Why does defending dignity bother you?" The words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. They were surgical. Julian blinked. Once. Twice. But no words came. His lips parted slightly, as if reaching for a response. But there was none prepared for this. He hadn't expected mercy to speak with such fire. He hadn't expected grace to feel like judgment. He hadn't expected the man in white to reach into his chest and touch the part of him that had grown numb in pursuit of exposure. And Pope Leo didn't press the moment. He simply watched. Not to gloat. But to wait. Julian sat down. Not slumped. Not ashamed. Just, still. As though something inside him had finally run out of questions. Behind him, one reporter quietly set her tablet down. Another crossed himself. Cardinal Tagle's hands trembled. He didn't hide it. He couldn't. His lips moved again, not speaking, not praying. Mourning. The dismantling was complete. Not through domination. Through discipline. Through a quiet that exposed the noise. No one applauded. No one whispered. Even the marble columns seemed to bow. And still Pope Leo stood, not as victor, but as witness. What you're seeing is grace dismantling pride. If that doesn't deserve your subscription, then at least have the courage to say why in the comments. Don't sit in silence unless you know what it costs. Join the voices that still believe silence can be sacred. Pope Leo did not return to his seat. He remained standing, rooted, unshaken, surrounded by silence so profound it had become a kind of altar. But he no longer looked at Julian. There was no need. The confrontation had passed. The fire had spoken. What remained now was the ash, and the invitation to see what still lived beneath it. He turned slowly, deliberately, and allowed his gaze to drift across the room, not at faces, but through them. Past cameras. Past columns. Past the politics and the press badges and the posturing. He was not addressing a journalist anymore. He was addressing a world. This moment, he said, is not about argument. His voice was soft, but it carried with authority only the broken ever learn to speak with. It is about the world we are becoming. The words were not a warning. They were a confession. We are quicker to condemn than to cradle. Quicker to post than to pray. We hunger for clarity, but reject the silence where it waits to be heard. He walked forward slowly, each step as unhurried as the truth itself. We cannot build justice on noise. We cannot teach mercy with rage. And we cannot claim to serve God while worshipping outrage. No one interrupted. No one dared. He folded his hands in front of him and closed his eyes, not to retreat, but to reach. Lord, he said, almost inaudibly, for those who cannot speak, give us ears. For those who suffer unseen, give us eyes. For those who demand answers too soon, give us hearts willing to wait for the weight of truth. No fanfare followed. No grand gesture. Just silence. And then, from his seat, still motionless except for the breath he had been holding, Cardinal Tagle nodded. He leaned slightly toward the Pope, his voice barely more than a whisper, but somehow heard by all. They weren't ready for that truth. The Pope didn't reply. He only opened his eyes, full of a sorrow that had become grace. There was nothing left to prove. Only something left to protect. He spoke for a generation. For the broken. For the voiceless. If that didn't move you, ask yourself what could. Subscribe. Or tell us, without pride or performance, why it didn't. Say it below. But let the world know where your heart truly stands. If you were in that room, in the stillness that followed those final words, what would you have said? Would you have spoken? Or sat in that sacred quiet, heart thundering with the weight of what you just witnessed? Would you have challenged him? Thanked him? Cried? Left? Or would you have done what most did, nothing, and let the moment settle like dust on stone? Because moments like these don't beg for applause. They don't trend. They don't sparkle. They simply change you, if you let them. Pope Leo didn't win anything that day. There were no headlines declaring his triumph. No viral soundbites to echo in the digital noise. But he left something behind in that room. Something heavier than scandal. Softer than dogma. Truer than politics. He left a question: is silence still holy in a world that won't stop shouting? And now, long after the lights dimmed and the cameras cut, that question rests with you. Was silence enough? Or is it time for voices like Leo's to rise again, not to speak over the world, but to remind it? Not to dominate, but to defend. Not to perform, but to protect. Not to be loud, but to be clear. May we all seek truth with humble hearts, not loud ones. May we have the courage to pause before we post, to kneel before we condemn, and to hold our convictions with open hands. Not clenched fists. This is Circle of God's Glory. And if you've listened this far, really listened, then be bold enough to take one more step. Subscribe. Not for numbers. Not for us. But because you know, something here rang true. If you're still watching and haven't subscribed, don't lie to yourself. Something in this hit you. Something cracked through. So hit that button, or own your silence in the comments. Let your name be counted, either in witness, or in retreat.